Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session, with a reference to series on inequality and difference, we are going to talk on tribes in India. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Vip. Dr. Shruti Vip is Assistant Professor in Department of History, PGDAV Evening College, University of Delhi. Dr. Vip has immense experience and her expertise in the area would definitely help us out in understanding today's topic in an elaborative way. So let's welcome our guest, Dr. Shruti Vip, and let's try to understand the tribes in India. Hello, ma'am. Welcome to the lecture.
Hello, Gitika. Thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity and welcome back, friends. But before we proceed with the topic tribes in India, with reference to the series on inequality and difference that we were doing, I would like to complete a few aspects of the lecture that were left incompleted, and these are related to Ambedkar's ideology. Having completed those aspects, then we would be discussing the new topic, that is tribes in India, and how one can understand the various aspects and facets of inequality and difference with reference to the tribes. So, going back to Ambedkar, a very important part of the discussion that was left was Ambedkar's vision regarding the state, and what were his ideas, what were his expectations from the Indian state and the kind of Indian state that he visualized, which many scholars have described as state socialism. I had already described the meaning and relevance of socialism and socialist values and principles when we were discussing Ambedkar in the last couple of lectures. But here what I am talking about is not plain and simple socialism. Rather, it is state socialism. So, it would be interesting to understand as to what were Ambedkar's ideas with reference to the Indian state. And this is also important to understand because the kind of constitution that he visualized and that he was also able to give a shape, a concrete form in the form of a number of written articles, also has an imprint of state socialism. The very concept of state socialism means that the state would implement a socialist program by controlling the industrial and agricultural sectors. So, according to Ambedkar, these two sectors were very crucial for a nation's progress and growth, that is agriculture and industry, and therefore, it was not advisable to let these two very important and crucial sectors be manipulated or controlled by the private sector. So, therefore, with this wider mission and goal in his mind, he visualized a kind of economic setup and a social and political setup which would give immense control to the government of India over these two very crucial sectors. Now, the two very important aspects of Ambedkar's state socialism were that if we are talking about industries, then the key industries and the basic industries, that is heavy iron and steel industry, etc., should be owned by the state. There should not be any private ownership of these industries, and this will help not only in rapid industrialization of the country and in rapid progress and growth of these industries, because these industries require huge capital investment and this could easily be taken over by the independent India. So, therefore, with the help of speedy industrialization, with the help of large scale investment in such capital intensive industries, and also this would ensure that the benefits of industrialization reach as many people as possible and they are not being appropriated by a few business houses. So, therefore, the benefits would be distributed equally amongst all sections of society. This was what he visualized and what he imagined, and therefore he also was of the opinion that insurance should also be under state control, and the private initiative should be discouraged as much as possible, because these should not be reduced to profit making ventures. Then as far as agriculture is concerned, for this sector also Ambedkar visualized that it should be treated as a state enterprise and not as a private initiative, which means that the state will initiate collective farming. It should incorporate principles of community farming, collective farming, because through this one could ensure again an equitable distribution of the resources, of the profit that was being made, and so not many would be left behind in the race of development. So farmers should be allowed to enjoy part of the agricultural produce, and the state should get some share in the form of levy. So therefore, by discouraging private enterprise and initiative in these basic sectors, Ambedkar paved the way for state socialist ideology, and food grains that were procured by way of levy will be used for distribution at fair prices in fair price shops, something like ration shops. And in other ways, in other words, one can say what he visualized was that the state will actively control both the industry as well as agriculture. So therefore, the state was not to be a passive player in this entire scheme of things. Rather, it was going to play a very important active watchdog, which was not only going to control the direction in which the economy was going, but also it was going to mobilize larger resources for future growth as well as for an equitable distribution of profits and the output. Now, what was this going to ensure? The most important agenda before Ambedkar was, of course, equitable distribution of resources, which had not really been taken care of either in British India or prior to that, when the feudal mode of production was largely in practice. So therefore, this new system he visualized would ensure an equitable distribution of wealth and protect the needy and the poor from further exploitation, from the exploitation that they had been experiencing for generations and for centuries. So therefore, rapid industrial progress was definitely sought after, but at the same time, welfare of all the poor and the needy people was also one of the most important benchmark for Ambedkar when he was devising the constitution. And this he thought was definitely responsibility of the state, and this could not be poor people could not be left at the mercy of the industrialists or capitalists, so as to imagine that in due course of time their condition would automatically improve, because India was going to be free now. So therefore, Ambedkar did not really equate betterment of the poor people with the freedom of the country. So he thought that it was important to take these practical measures so that the exploitation would come to an end, and not only political freedom but even economic and social freedom would be enjoyed by the marginalized sections of society. What he championed was an inalterable state socialism. That is, state socialism should be the cornerstone of the strategy, and it should not depend on individual parties whether they want to implement it or not. So therefore, in the parliamentary form of government, there is not only one political party which would be at the center, which would be in power for all time to come, and different parties would come depending on the mandate given to them. So therefore, power doesn't stay in the hands of one particular group or political party. So therefore, Ambedkar suggested that the program of state socialism should be made an inalterable part of the constitution. So therefore, whichever party comes to power and whichever party joins the electoral fray, they have to devise ways and means to adhere to these basic guidelines. And so therefore, state socialism should become part of the constitution, should become part of the entire strategy on the basis of which a government devises ways and means to run the government, and also devises the planning. The whole planning should be dependent on that ideology, and therefore no alternate ideology or program could be championed by any political party which was going to form the government. So therefore, his emphasis on industrialization or on agricultural development also incorporated these principles and values. And also he was more in favor of expanding industrialization, because he was of the opinion that unless and until there was out migration of agricultural workers who largely belonged to Dalit community from the rural areas to the urban areas, and they started experiencing the openness of the urban centers, and they started enjoying a wider range of opportunities that were available in the urban areas, the change cannot really come in their lives. So he was all out for a rapid development and progress of industries, a much larger range of industrialization than had been visualized by many personalities of his time, and he also wanted to ease the burden on agriculture by opening more and more avenues of development. Now, coming to the issue of Ambedkar and Indian Constitution, this is also a very important aspect that needs to be discussed at greater length, because we are right now discussing his ideas on inequality and difference, and there is no better way than to refer to Indian Constitution and what were his contributions as far as these two aspects of inequality and difference are concerned. So definitely in this regard, one can talk about fundamental rights, fundamental duties, directive principles, and also protection of minorities. Now, the protection of minorities was a very important issue that was not only raised by Ambedkar, but also he tried to incorporate as many provisions in the constitution so as to deal with this issue. This was particularly important due to the background of partition, which had resulted in extreme polarization and that communal frenzy that people had witnessed as a part of independence and partition had to be tackled in a more positive and constructive way. So the guarantee of constitutional protection to these rights, that is Article 32 of the Indian Constitution, which guarantees judicial protection to fundamental rights, is very important. Also, he was in favor of a very strong government at the center. So while he was in favor of fundamental rights that must be given to the citizens, and citizens should have these rights which are justiciable, so a citizen is not at the mercy of the government, rather it is a relationship of mutual trust and understanding. But at the same time, he was also in favor of a strong central government, because Ambedkar was well aware of the fact that India was a caste-ridden society. So nothing was going to change immediately after 1947. So even if the foreign rule was coming to an end and India was becoming a free country and a sovereign socialist democratic republic, but unless and until there was change at the ground level, there was the socio-cultural change which was going to take a long time to happen, it was important for the state to rule with a strong hand, so that these caste-ridden divisive politics could be taken care of. So therefore, he was of the opinion that only a strong central government can take care of the rights and privileges of the lower castes, and therefore only such a government could be on the sides of the lower castes and also help them in mobilizing themselves and in empowering them as well. He believed that casteism would be all the more powerful at local and provincial levels, which would not only hamper government machinery at those levels, but would also enhance further the notion of purity and pollution, which was just not going away from the Indian caste system. So therefore, according to Ambedkar, it was important to empower lower castes both at the local as well as provincial levels, and definitely at the level of the central government as well. And he was also well aware of the fact that casteist pressures would fail to protect and lower, especially the lower castes, from higher caste oppression. So therefore, he was well aware of the rising social pressures which were going to definitely exert a negative influence over the political forces also. The national government, therefore, as visualized by Ambedkar, had to be strong enough in order to deal with such casteist pressures, and it should be strong enough so that these pressures are not only shunned away right in the beginning, but then there are constitutional guarantees in the form of fundamental rights, directive principles, fundamental duties, which would help the government as well as the citizens to deal with such pressures. Therefore, to deal with these with the casteist ideology which was refusing to die, the government, only a strong central government could have taken a rigid stand, could have taken a tough stand, and therefore Ambedkar was all out for a very strong government. Then Ambedkar's opinion on minorities. This is also quite important, because when we are talking about inequality and difference, then definitely different communities having different religious ideologies, ways of life, language, religion, belief, etc., they can also be included in this ambit. So therefore, according to Ambedkar, besides caste, religion was another very a great divisive force, and therefore minorities could be subject to political pressures and also social harassment in independent India. And this was something which was really not called for, because as I just said, the values of equality, liberty, fraternity, democratic principles, etc., were at the core of the constitution making. So therefore, Ambedkar was of the opinion that some guarantee must be there, so as to the minorities also have a share in the power. They not only have a share in the power, but they also have a share in the whatever economic fruits of development the country is going to reap. So therefore, minority communities should get an opportunity to elect their representatives, and Ambedkar was all out in support for this provision. So therefore, he wanted a definite representation in the executive and also political reservations in legislature, and the appointment of a special officer for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes under Article 338, etc. There were a number of other provisions also, which I am not going to talk about right now, but just to make you aware of the spirit of the constitution and how Ambedkar contributed positively in bringing about so many additions and subtractions, so as to ensure justice for all. Then he was also of the view that democracy is not merely majority rule, or it is not only a political setup whereby the majority are able to have their way and to decide the fate of the country. So therefore, caste and communal minorities must be given proper representation. they must be respected for their values, for their lifestyle, for whatever they stand for, and they should not be taken for granted, or no attempt should be made in order to assimilate them completely with the majority opinion. So, therefore, according to Ambedkar, democracy could be meaningful only if these differences were respected and incorporated as it is. So, therefore, Ambedkar was very much against majority syndrome, that is a rule by the majority, or a political process whereby it is only the majority opinion which counts. And this is very relevant in today's times, when we see so much of hardship that is being faced by particular sections of society, just because the majority opinion is not in their favor. Now, another very important aspect that one must touch upon is the aspect of social reform, and how Ambedkar was all the time open to the idea of social reform, and it was not as if the period of social reform had ended and now only political change and political reform or economic upliftment was to be on the cards. So, the most important contribution in this aspect that can be attributed to Ambedkar was that Ambedkar considered family as the most important institution that could bring about social reform in a huge country like India. And also another important facet of reform according to Ambedkar was, of course, religious reform, because according to him, religion with its dogma, superstition and rigidity was also depriving the poor and the needy from their rights. So, therefore, according to Ambedkar, family reform included abolition of evil practices of orthodox practices like child marriage, etc., or lack of education for the girl child, or malnutrition that was generally found among the girl children, because preference was given to the boy siblings. So, therefore, on the whole, his focus was not only on the upliftment of the caste, but also on the upliftment of women, and gender issues definitely formed a very important narrative of the entire idea of social reform that Ambedkar had chalked out. Then he also criticized the degradation of women in Indian society, and in fact he traced this degradation to the past as to how the tradition and traditional knowledge system had been unkind to its women folk. He believed that women were entitled to an equal status with men in family, in terms of property, in terms of education, in terms of employment. And he was also a strong champion of the right to education for women. He commented that religion, the traditional religions, had deprived women of right to property, which again was which must be changed, and for this he wanted the state to take a stand. In the Hindu Code Bill which he prepared, he took care that women should be given a share in the property. While he organized the untouchables, he always called upon women of the untouchable community to come forward and to participate in the social and political movements. So, therefore, his vision was much larger. It was not only caste discrimination that he was critical of, but also gender discrimination, and even within the Dalit community, he was trying to mobilize women at a time when even the upper caste women were not really able to enjoy equal rights or demand greater rights for themselves from their family members. So, he was always a step forward, and through his larger perspective, he also incorporated gender issues in the overall caste mobilization framework that he evolved. Then coming to the economic factors in his ideology, and how Ambedkar's philosophy also not only gave a lot of importance to economic upliftment, to economic progress of the country through state socialism and a greater expansion of industrialization with reference to the overall progress. He was also of the opinion that untouchables must free themselves from the social bonds which are very tightly maintained in the countryside, that is in the rural areas. And so therefore, the idea of village community was not an ideal for Ambedkar. In fact, he was very critical of village community. So the idea of village community, which was very ideal for Mahatma Gandhi, and he was of the opinion that the entire country should emulate the values and principles that were being followed in the village communities. Ambedkar was at another extreme end, and he was of the opinion that the exploitation of Dalits was continuing due to the perpetuation, due to the continuation of the so-called village community. So therefore, he was of the opinion that if the marginalized sections of society have to bring about a change in their lives, they must move away from villages, they must look at greener pastures, they must move beyond the village community. And because there was a particular kind of economic and social bondage in the village community, and the Dalits were supposed to perform menial tasks for the higher castes, and this was being validated as part of the Varnashram Dharam philosophy, which was definitely not going to change overnight. So therefore, he did not want untouchables to be connected to specific occupations. He wanted them to get educated, just like he had got educated, and to leave the hereditary occupations that had been thrust on them for so many generations, and then just move out of the village community, maybe migrate to the urban centers, migrate to newly emerging cities, towns, try their luck there. But for that, of course, they had to get skilled, they had to have the right kind of education, they have to have the right kind of support system. So therefore, what Ambedkar was pointing out can also be discussed with reference to Bourdieu. Just like Bourdieu said that an individual can progress to the extent of his social capital. So therefore, a person who does not have a social capital which is varied enough or powerful enough to explore wider connections for him or her, then nothing will change. So, in talking in those terms, Ambedkar also pointed out that unless and until we broaden our horizon and people move out of the myopic village community, which is only forcing them to perform hereditary occupations generation after generation, things are not really going to change. Also, he was aware of the situation that the poorer sections of society were dependent on the rich and the powerful for their sustenance. So therefore, some via media had to be found so that the exploitation would not continue unabated. The economic dimension of their servitude must come to an end, according to Ambedkar, and he insisted that the Dalits should stop doing the traditional work and open up wider avenues for themselves through education and through greater entrepreneurial skills, so that they are no more dependent on village community, but are able to perform well in other sectors also. So therefore, having discussed these various aspects, I think now we have covered almost all the aspects that are related to Ambedkar's philosophy, and this would help you in understanding his ideas related to inequality and difference. Thanks a lot.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this session. Friends, you are requested to be with us as we are back after a short break. Thank you so very much. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on one of the important topics, and before we start with the tribes in India, we would like to complete our session on Ambedkar, which we are conducting since our previous session, and we are going to get in-depth knowledge on the topic to once again, as we have with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Webb. Dr. Shruti Webb is Assistant Professor in Department of History, PGDAV, Evening College, University of Delhi. So let's welcome our guest, Dr. Webb, and let's try to understand more about Ambedkar, and afterwards, yes, on the tribes of India, we are going to have this session. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
Hello Vidika. So welcome back friends. We were discussing why Ambedkar wanted Dalits to move out of the village community. So here I would briefly talk about what were his ideas about the village community. He considered a village community to be a den of localism, communalism, parochial ideas, and also narrow-mindedness. So this is how he described a village community. So there was no flavor of idealism or a utopian ideology that is generally ascribed to village as an ideal place, a village as a place where one can find relaxation and a lot of peace is there in a village community due to its simplicity. Rather, Ambedkar pointed out that these are the discrepancies that remain and which are experienced by the Dalits in the village community. So, therefore, if they have to fight back localism, if they have to come to the center stage, if they have to experience equality and progress, and if they have to taste success, then they must move out of this myopic village community with its four walls of community identity, a lot of orthodoxy which can be associated with rural life, and also social inequality which they have to experience on a day-to-day basis. And only by moving out, untouchables can experience freedom from village bondage. So therefore, he associated rural life with village bondage, especially for the low caste people. And according to Ambedkar, another alternative that could be, because not everyone could leave the rural areas and migrate to cities, because not everyone was educated or trained enough to do that. So what alternative he offered to them? Here the alternative that he offered was that even if you continue to stay in the rural areas, and even if you continue to be part of the village community, just stop performing the traditional jobs of cleaning, scavenging, etc. that you are doing, so as to bring about a change in your life and get yourself skilled enough to find different kind of jobs and opportunities, whatever is available near you. So therefore, these were the kind of radical ideas that he put forward, and he tried to mobilize Dalits, and he tried to bring about a change in their life. Then another very important principle that must be discussed with reference to Ambedkar and with reference to Constitution is the idea of equality, liberty and fraternity, which of course is the the focal point and the cornerstone philosophy of Indian Constitution. And the basis of Ambedkar's ideology was that liberty alone cannot be sufficient. In fact, liberty must exist together with equality. So liberty, only if it exists with equality, is of any use. So what benefit can a poor people, can low caste people enjoy if they have freedom but they are not equal? So it is of no use. So therefore, just for the sake of rhetoric, if we say that the state has given liberty to all the citizens of India, how does it make a difference? Because unless and until you remove the gap between, you bridge the gap between the rich and the poor, then that liberty is definitely not going to be enjoyed by the poor, but rather it would be appropriated by the rich only. Then political democracy, according to Ambedkar, without social democracy and economic justice is meaningless. Now this is also a very important and a grave statement, which incorporates political, economic as well as social factors. So therefore, political democracy, that is the right to vote, and no discrimination on the basis of right to vote is fine. But then unless and until we also talk about social democracy, that is socially also there are no divisions between the castes and no discrimination on the basis of caste, unless and until social democracy is achieved, political democracy is of no use. So therefore, he was always thinking step ahead as to how to remove injustice from society by not only philosophically talking about democracy, but rather finding ways and means to incorporate practical solutions to the problem. And again, social democracy and political democracy on their own are meaningless unless and until economic equality is also achieved. That is, the resources of the country are equitably distributed, equally distributed among the citizens of India. So only if these three kinds of democracies are achieved, that is economic, political as well as social, can there be a complete justice be done to the lower castes. Then equality and liberty, according to Ambedkar, will be realized only when there is a strong sense of unity among members of the society, which again depends on overlooking the differences and considering the entire Indian community as one solid unit, irrespective of the caste, class, community, religion, etc. So therefore, a very important factor according to Ambedkar was the sense of brotherhood, that is the sense of the larger community and not getting bogged down by the differences on the basis of caste, class, religion, etc. So therefore, the feeling of brotherhood, that is the idea of belonging to one country, was important, but then the idea of belonging to one community was equally important, if not more important, according to Ambedkar, because only through this idea the internal differences and the divisions and the exploitative tendencies that remained in the society, that had continued in society for so many centuries, could come to an end. And therefore, according to Ambedkar, this was the ideal democracy that he was visualizing, and not merely political democracy where all the citizens of India have right to vote, because that would not really amount to complete either complete democracy or complete equality. Then fraternity again was the value that can be associated to brotherhood, to community feeling, and also it becomes one of the stepping stones again for both equality as well as liberty. Ambedkar made it clear that the ideal society of his imagination would be a society based on these three principles, that is equality, liberty, fraternity, but of all types, that is social, political and economic. There was, if we go back to the history of political mobilization of Dalits, which Ambedkar had started visualizing, it was much earlier, that is 1920s was the decade that became very important and crucial as far as Dalit mobilization is concerned under Ambedkar's leadership. In fact, much earlier than Ambedkar, this had already been attempted by Phule, which I have already discussed in one of the earlier lectures, where he attempted to reform rather than politically mobilize them, because Phule was of the opinion that unless and until the social change comes within the Dalit community, within the marginalized sections of society, things are not really going to change. But Ambedkar was a step ahead. Of course, he was from 20th century, whereas Ambedkar was a century earlier. So therefore, there had to be this radical shift, but the radical shift was from social to social and political reforms. So therefore, according to Ambedkar, it was no longer feasible only to talk about social reforms, but equally important, or rather more important, to politically mobilize Dalits and to make them more empowered politically. So Ambedkar was the only spokesman and the preeminent advocate of the Dalits from 1919, and for more than 3.5 decades in the pre-independence period, he kept on championing for the rights, not only social rights but also political and economic rights, educational rights for the Dalits. And throughout this period, Congress had no concrete program to protect the interests of the depressed classes. A party which had come into being in 1885 continued to evade the issue of Dalit exploitation till 1917, and it was only after 1917 when a parallel Dalit mobilization was taking place under Ambedkar's leadership that the Congress leaders were forced to take up this issue, and this is how the whole movement came into being. So therefore, mobilization by Phule and Ambedkar in 1930s was firmly based on the belief that unless the caste system is destroyed and the social evil of untouchability ends, nothing can be changed, and Dalits must acquire political power in order to bring about change in their life. So therefore, some very important contributions that Ambedkar made with this regard of politically empowering Dalits was, in 1942, he formed the All India Scheduled Caste Federation, AISCF, in addition to the Indian Labour Party, that is ILP, to mobilize a broader section of the Indian society and not exclusively the Dalits. So now Ambedkar was also, thinking beyond Dalits post 1930s, where he started championing the cause of the other marginalized sections of society also, and he started raising demands on behalf of the labor class, the workers, and the exploited sections of society who were not really being given their dues. Therefore, he started appealing to the wider audiences in both the industrial as well as agricultural sectors to demand rights for themselves, and not only economic justice but also social and political justice for them. So therefore, this was something like a class-like strategy that had come into being, and it is very interesting and relevant to study Ambedkar from this perspective, because most of time we think about Ambedkar with reference to Dalits or with reference to the rights and how he championed for the rights and privileges of the untouchable community. But he was much beyond that. He was kind of mobilizing a pan-Indian movement of the marginalized sections, of the exploited sections of society, and one could definitely find class character, class-like analysis in this entire scheme of things, where he was trying to mobilize the lower class of the Indian society against the rich and the powerful, and he was trying ways and means to somehow raise a pan-Indian movement vis-a-vis the exploitation by the upper castes and class. Now, with this note, I end this discussion on Ambedkar, and now the next part of the lecture would be related to another category which is very relevant to talk about with reference to inequality and difference, and this is tribes, the tribal movements, the tribes in India, and how tribes as a category must be understood, and how it is different definitely, but then how they have also suffered at the expense of the development paradigm that had been going on after 1947. And a question that must be raised right at the outset is that despite constitutional provisions of equality for all, we must all raise a question that have really tribes experienced this equality, the so-called equality, liberty and fraternity? Have they been able to experience that in their lives, or the story says something else? So, here right at the onset, I would like to refer to the idea or a theme, that is the people versus the resources. So, how are people able to enjoy the resources, or if the people are being deprived of the resources that had naturally been provided to them by nature? Because tribes, as you all know, are not staying in urban areas. There are tribal areas, there are states which have influx, which have pockets of tribes, tribal settlements are there, and in due course of our discussion I would be talking about them. So, the unjust tribal predicament in India, both pre and post independence, must be discussed. That is, what was the strategy that was devised by the colonial regime under initially English East India Company and then later on the British government? What strategy was devised by them vis-a-vis the tribal areas? Because most of the tribal areas were thickly forested areas, whether we talk about the Chota Nagpur region, Chhattisgarh, or we talk about the Santhals, or we talk about a number of tribes in South India, most in Rajasthan. Most of the tribes, they used to live in areas that were thickly forested, and they were homes for resources of timber, and this timber was much in demand post 1850s, with the starting of Indian Railways, and there was a greater demand that was there, not only for the construction activities, for shipping industry, for dockyards, but also for laying railway lines, sleeper coaches, etc. So therefore, timber was much in demand. At the same time, another change that had come about was the plantation economy and commercialization of agriculture and increasing reliance on plantation crops. And of course, to establish these plantation crops, many times the forest use area had to be converted. Forests had to be cut and plantations had to be started, and for this tribes had to be uprooted. So therefore, all these changes started coming about from late 18th century onwards itself. It was not as if only after coming in of railways only that the tribes started experiencing greater interference by the colonial regime. In fact, from late 18th century, one comes across a number of tribal rebellions from time to time. For example, the Kol rebellion, the Oraon rebellion, Munda rebellion in Chota Nagpur region during 19th century, and so on and so forth. And through these tribal rebellions, the tribes were trying to assert their independence, their identity. They were trying to assert their control over the resources, but because they were not really able to fight the mighty colonial regime, gradually they had to accept their fate. Either they migrated or they died fighting, and therefore gradually the tribal areas got converted into states where the Britishers implemented their own political, legal, revenue administration. Now, as you all know, that to begin with, the basic feature that distinguished a tribal community from a non-tribal community was subsistence on non-accumulative economy. So, the tribes by nature were on the move, they were non-accumulative. They were not really following the traditional settled life, which is generally followed by the non-tribals, and they were living in small communities tightly knit by kinship, marriage and labor pooling systems. So therefore, these were some of the features that differentiated the tribal community from a non-tribal community. Also, they were fierce defenders of their resource bases. And what were the resource bases of the tribes? Of course, the forests, the hills, the mountains, the valleys, and these all were crucial to their livelihoods, especially the forests, which were not only used by them for hunting, but also for gathering a large number of herbs and honey and fruits, flowers, etc., and of course fuel. So therefore, one can describe tribes or tribal culture as a non-literate culture, which was largely based on patriarchal norms, but also there were exceptions and matriarchy was also there. But definitely the so-called level of civilization that was generally claimed by the people who were staying in the plains or the non-tribal areas was not visualized for them. So therefore, when you come to the issue of colonial policy in tribal areas, once the rule of English East India Company was established and gradually it started expanding over a large number of states. So therefore, there was a need that was felt for incorporating the tribal areas also within the ambit of the colonial regime, so as to deal with the issue of lawlessness. So it is in this regard that one must talk about the creation of the forest department in search of timber, and timber, as I just mentioned, was in great demand post 1850s due to number of construction activities and railways, as well as ships and railway lines. So therefore, once there was an extension of settled agriculture to enhance land revenue requirements of the colonial regime, and there was an extension of zamindari, malguzari, rayatwadi settlements in the tribal areas, the things were really going to change. And this change was not to the liking of the tribal communities, because tribes were not used to either settled agricultural life, nor they were used to paying revenues or taxes to the higher authorities, because theirs was more like an egalitarian structure where the tribal headmen was offered voluntary gifts, and there was also a lot of interdependence between among the tribals, and the whole concept of tribal community was gradually petering away. It was getting shattered due to the new administrative policies that were introduced by the colonial regime. So therefore, the introduction of non-Adivasi or non-tribal settler communities from late 19th century into the tribal areas was definitely going to be a great challenge for the tribes who were already staying in these areas for so many centuries, and which they considered to be their rightful place. And slowly the outsiders who were known as Dikus in the Chota Nagpur region, they were not really accepted within the tribal community, and there was lot of hatred towards them. But gradually Dikus, because of their hold over the political state of affairs, as well as due to their greater economic power which they had been granted by the colonial regime, as they had come to this area as money lenders or zamindars or jagirdars, they started gradually appropriating the lands of the tribals, and therefore there was a shift from a shift vis-a-vis the ownership of land from tribals to non-tribals. So therefore, Dikus not only became politically powerful, economically powerful, but they also territorially started mobilizing greater control in their own hands. Another change that started was that the tribals were now being pushed from the tribal areas to the areas where more labor was needed, for example, the plantations, or in those sites where indentured labor was needed or construction activity was going on, or in the upper watersheds or hilly regions. They started migrating of their own in order to protect themselves, or in order to just get away from this new system that was gradually being enforced on them and which was not to their liking. So therefore, throughout we see that throughout the history of the colonial regime, the tribals were not meek individuals or meek community, rather they kept on fighting against the colonial regime, and a number of rebellions that have been studied as part of the research that has been going on as to how many rebellions or revolts took place against the colonial regime prior to 1857. So one can clearly say that 1857 was not the first revolt of its kind, because there were a number of small scale revolts, and these were kind of championed by the tribals against the outsiders. So therefore, having introduced you to this topic, now I shall take a break, and soon we would be discussing in greater detail this topic. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this session. Friends, you are requested to write to us. Yes, write to us at info.cec@nic.in. This is the ID where you can post your questions as well as your feedback regarding the lecture, as well as the lectures on the entire series which are uploaded for you on the YouTube. So friends, keep watching us and keep writing us. We are taking your leave today with the promise that we are going to meet soon and would be discussing more in our series on inequality and difference. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Dalit.